There are a lot of things that I love about Christmas time. I do love Christmas music. It's great to hear Christmas music, whether it's on the radio or you walk into a store or even just kind of at home. I love lights. You drive down the street and you see all the different Christmas lights. But one of my favorite things about Christmas is I like Christmas movies. Anybody, do we have any Christmas movie fans out there? Anybody? Yeah. And when I say Christmas movies, I'm talking about like the classics. You know, you have like Christmas Vacation, or you have Elf, or you have some of these. I'm trying not to bag here, so don't take this as judgment. I can't get into like the Hallmark version of, and I'm not judging you if you do. I'm not judging you if you do. My mom loves Christmas Hallmark movies and she's here, but I just can't get into like, all I want for Christmas is a spouse, you know, or something like that, or like Santa needs a new Mrs. Claus or something. I just can't, like, God bless you if you do. Go ahead and watch those. Jesus loves you. But I enjoy these Christmas movies. And for me, like, what really makes a good Christmas movie is the story and the characters. So, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be a classic. There is, like, this, I can't even remember what it's called. I think it's a Netflix, like, rom-com movie that is a Christmas movie, came out a couple years ago. My wife and I have watched it a couple times. So I'm not against Christmas love and Christmas romance, but it's got to be, like, a really good story. Like, the character, that's what you love about, like, even when you watch Elf, like, Will Ferrell's character is just a cool character. And you know, when you watch the Griswolds or even like the Grinch, you watch some of these versions of the Grinch, they're just cool characters and really cool stories. And to me, that it's not just the theme of Christmas. It's not just the fact that in Christmas movies there's Christmas trees or lights or gifts or whatever. It's that, man, here's this story with these really cool characters and this really unique kind of story that's going on. Now, of course, for me, the coolest Christmas story is the story that's at the heart of Christmas, and it's the birth of Jesus. And I love the story of the birth of Jesus because, for all the reasons I just said, it's got these really cool cast of characters. You know, if you ever look at a manger scene or a nativity scene, maybe you have one in your house or something, but you have Mary and Joseph, this young couple. You have these dirty outcast shepherds. You have these magi, these priestly scholars from the east, this kind of random group of people that all kind of gets thrown together in this one event, in this one story. And it's full of all this kind of intrigue and uncertainty, and it's just a great story. And one of the things we're talking about this Christmas is that the story of the birth of Jesus doesn't just come out of nowhere. A lot of times when we look at the Bible, we look at it and think like, you know, there's the first part of the Bible called the Old Testament that tells the story of ancient Israel and of Israel's journey with God. And we almost look at the first part of the Bible like, oh, well, this part was a failure and God wiped it all clean, and then he just started over with Jesus in the New Testament, in the second part of the Bible. But that's not how the New Testament writers understand it. That the New Testament writers don't look at the Old Testament and think, oh, well, this is a failure and God just started over with Jesus. That the way the New Testament writers talk about Jesus is that Jesus is actually the fulfillment of the Old Testament story. That the Old Testament story of Israel is always going somewhere. It's always moving somewhere. And when Jesus comes along, Jesus is essentially the apex of that story. That Jesus, in the New Testament, he's often called Christ. In fact, sometimes we'll just refer to Jesus as Christ, sometimes Jesus Christ. I actually had a friend who thought that was his last name, like his family name was Christ, but Christ is a title. It is actually a title. And it's a Greek translation, because the New Testament is written in Greek. It's a Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah. And Messiah is this very like Jewish idea. It's this idea that comes from ancient Israel, that the Messiah is the one that God was going to send to make everything right. The Messiah was going to turn everything around. The Messiah was going to restore God as the one true king over all creation. And so to be the Messiah is to be Israel's Messiah. And so when Jesus shows up, he is Israel's Messiah. Paul will say all the promises that God makes through Israel are yes in Jesus. And so Jesus is this apex of the story of Israel. He is Israel's Messiah. And so what we're doing this Christmas is we're kind of looking back a little bit into the story of Israel, into the story of the Old Testament, and we're looking at what does it really mean to be Israel's Messiah? In what ways does Jesus kind of like bring the story of Israel to its fullness? What does it mean for that story, the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament, to find its completion and its fulfillment in the person of Jesus? Now, the word that's most often used to talk about how Jesus kind of completes the Old Testament story is the word prophecy. And you probably familiar with that word before, whether you've heard it within churches or scripture or anything. But usually when we think of prophecy, we think of one kind of prophecy. We think of this idea of prediction and fulfillment. But there are New Testament scholars that argue. One scholar in particular kind of makes this argument, and a lot of others join him. His name is Greg Beale, and he talks about how when the New Testament writers talk about prophecy, they refer to kind of two different kinds of prophecy. And here's the language he uses. He says the two different kinds of prophecy you'll find in the New Testament are direct verbal prophecy and indirect typological. You don't have to remember those titles at all. That's just the titles he uses. But here's what he means. Direct verbal is what I just said. Direct verbal is what we think of where someone makes a prediction and that prediction finds fulfillment. It's like the Nostradamus type of prophecy, right? This will happen, and then lo and behold, this thing happens. That's what most of us think of when we think of prophecy. But actually in the New Testament, the more common type of prophecy is what they refer to as indirect typological. And here's what that means. What that means is the New Testament writers will quote from the Old Testament, but they're not saying like this is prediction fulfillment. What they're saying is this is like that. That they will look back into the story of Israel and see what God was up to in the story of Israel, and they'll quote from that story, from that book of the Old Testament, from that passage. They'll quote because what they'll say is, hey, what Jesus is doing here is really the completion, the fulfillment of what God is trying to do here. That not that this passage was a direct prediction about Jesus, but again, to quote Paul, this is how Jesus fulfills that. That this thing is like that thing. That's actually the most common type of prophecy that's talked about in the New Testament. It's that they're similar. That this thing that's happening is like that. We're going to spend the next 2 weeks looking at one particular prophet in the Old Testament. His name is Isaiah. And Isaiah has one of the longest books in the Old Testament. The book of Isaiah bears his name. Isaiah is his ideas, his thoughts are key to really the Old Testament story, but also to the development of the New Testament. And so next week, we're going to look at something, actually a few things Isaiah says that fall under the direct verbal, where Isaiah is actually going to talk about Jesus specifically. And he's going to say, hey, this is what God is going to do in and through the Messiah whenever the Messiah shows up, because Isaiah is a prophet long before Jesus ever shows up, centuries before Jesus ever shows up. But what we're going to look at today is kind of more this indirect. We're going to look at this story. It's a pivotal story from Israel's history. And one of the New Testament writers, Matthew, who actually writes the Gospel of Matthew, his account of life of Jesus, he's going to quote this story because what he's going to say is, hey, what happens in Jesus is like this thing. And by quoting that, Matthew's gonna kind of reveal to us, hey, here's partly what it means to be the Messiah, but maybe more importantly to us is, here's what it means to respond to the Messiah. And so to understand Isaiah, we're gonna go back to the 8th century BCE, to, well, we would call it the Middle East, but when you talk about it like looking back, they would refer to it as the ancient Near East. And so in the 8th century BCE, in the ancient Near East, Assyria is the powerhouse kingdom. They're the powerhouse empire. They kind of control everything. You don't mess with Assyria. And pretty much everyone around is at the mercy of Assyria. Now, you might have to pay money to Assyria. You might have to pay taxes to Assyria. Assyria might directly control you. It kind of varied from nation to nation, from kingdom to kingdom, exactly how much control Assyria exercised over you, but they were in charge and everybody knew it. Now, in the 8th century BCE, the kingdom of Israel, when Israel begins as a nation in the Old Testament story, it is one unified kingdom, but it eventually splits into two kingdoms. The northern part keeps the name Israel, the southern part keeps the name Judah. So by the time you get to the 8th century, Israel is now in this divided kingdom. So you have these two kingdoms made up of, Hebrew people or Israelite people, Jewish people, Israel and Judah. In the 8th century BCE, when Assyria is the powerhouse, these two kingdoms, Aram and Israel, decide that they are going to join forces and overthrow Assyria. So the king of Aram, his name is Rezin, and the king of Israel at the time, his name is Pekah. So they are putting together this coalition to overthrow Assyria. Now they're smart enough to know that alone they don't have the power to defeat Assyria. They need more help. So they come down to Judah and ask King Ahaz to join their coalition to overthrow Israel. Ahaz, who's apparently the one smart king among them, looks at their combined forces and looks at Assyria and comes to the conclusion, we stand no chance. If we go up against Assyria, even all three of these nations combined, we are going to get destroyed. So Ahaz refuses to join their coalition to overthrow Assyria. That does not stop Pekah and Rezin from trying to put pressure on Ahaz to join. And the pressure they put isn't just political pressure. They literally begin to send troops into Judah. They will lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, which is the capital of Judah. And laying siege is you just surround the city. You cut off food supply. You cut off water supply. So their intimidation to try to get Ahaz to join their coalition becomes militaristic. So now Ahaz finds himself in this impossible situation because he cannot keep resisting Aram and Israel. They're going to keep coming at him, and if he doesn't do what they want him to do, eventually they're going to overthrow him, and they'll put a king in place that will join their coalition. They'll go up against Assyria, and they'll get rocked. But if Ahaz gives in and joins Israel and Aram, then they're going to go up against Assyria, and they're going to lose. So Ahaz now finds himself in this impossible situation, and what do I do? It's a lose-lose. No matter which option I pick, we are going to lose. And what we're told in the book of Isaiah is that the hearts of Ahaz and his people, their hearts, they were shaken like trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. They're scared. They're scared because they know they are in this possible situation where no matter what they do, they are going to lose, they are going to be conquered, they are going to be oppressed. So this is when God comes to this prophet. The word prophet actually means spokesperson. That's the whole job of a prophet. A prophet speaks on behalf of God to the people. So God comes to the prophet Isaiah and he says, Isaiah, I need you to give this message to Ahaz, the king of Judah. And so Isaiah 7, verse 3 through 4, here's what God tells his prophet Isaiah. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, go out, you and your son, Shear-Jashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field. Say to him, be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Don't lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and of the son of Remelah. Remelah is Pekah, the king of, it's his dad. And so Isaiah goes out to Ahaz, and the description we're told of where Ahaz is, what he's doing is he's trying to secure a water supply for the city of Jerusalem. He's anticipating that at any moment, Aram and Israel are going to come down and they're going to lay siege to Jerusalem again. They're going to attack it. They're going to fight it. They're going to do something. So what we need to make sure we survive is that in the city, we have enough clean water to sustain us and keep us alive. So he's out literally preparing for another invasion from these enemies that are around him. And Isaiah comes to him, and Isaiah's message to him is, dude, just relax. And this is funny because apparently this is what it looks like when God talks trash, because God says, don't be afraid of these two smoldering stubs of firewood. That's how he refers to these kings. He goes, look, I get that they're kings. Okay, they're kings, but these are kings that they're just flaming out. This is not like a roaring bonfire. These are just like these little stubs that are going out. They're nothing. Do not be afraid of them. Like you just relax, take a deep breath. These guys are not in charge. They're not in control. And Isaiah goes on, if you skip to verse 7, and here's kind of the heart of what Isaiah tells Ahaz at this moment. He says, this is what the sovereign Lord says. It will not take place. It will not happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim, which is a way of talking about Israel, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Remelah's son. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. And so again, God continues to talk trash about these two kings. And notice he never actually says Pekah's name. He just keeps referring to him by his dad's name. And so he talks about, and what he says right from the very beginning is, it's not going to happen. These guys are not going to conquer you. Okay, Aram and Israel, they are not going to defeat you. They're not going to overcome you. And then this is where God is like, I mean, look at who their kings are. Like, they're nobodies. It's not going to happen. All you need to do, Ahaz, is just stand firm in your faith. That's the heart of Isaiah. That's what Isaiah doesn't tell him, like, do this, do that. Isaiah just says, just please don't do anything stupid. You don't, just chill out, just relax. What you are afraid of is not going to happen. In fact, Eventually, he gives some time. In fact, eventually, these two nations that you're afraid of, they're going to be done. They're going to be wiped out. They're going to be conquered. They're going to be nothing. You will be fine. And his instructions to him are just stand firm. Isaiah then does something that's really uncharacteristic of not just a prophet, but anyone who represents God, a priest, whatever the time. And really, he does it on God's instructions, and it's something that's uncharacteristic of God. What Isaiah tells Ahaz is he says, Ahaz, as proof that you're going to be okay, and these other two nations will fall, and you're going to be fine, go ahead and ask God for a sign. Ask God to do something, and when he does it, that will be proof to you that you're going to be okay. Now, normally, asking God for a sign is like a sign of weakness. Like, I don't trust you, God. I need proof. Your word is not enough for me. I need you to do something to prove that this is actually going to happen. So that's usually looked down upon. It's usually like a lack of faith. But in this case, for whatever reason, God recognizes what Ahaz is up against, recognizes how difficult this is going to be. So God says, hey, in this case, I'm going to do this for you. I know what I'm asking you is difficult, so I'm going to give you this sign. Ask me for whatever sign you want, and I'll give it to you as proof. And Ahaz refuses. Ahaz says, no, I would never do that. And Ahaz's refusal for the sign, the way he says it is kind of rooted in like, no. I would never question God. I would never doubt God. I would never. So he does it on the grounds of like religious fidelity. Like, you're God. I would never ask you to do that. But if you read the way it's recorded in Isaiah, Ahaz's refusal to ask for a sign is actually rooted in his lack of trust, that he's still afraid. He's still afraid. He doesn't want to do nothing. He doesn't want to stand. He's afraid to lose his life. He's afraid to lose his country. He's not trusting what Isaiah is saying. And so Ahaz says, no, I would never, ever ask for a sign. Isaiah gets upset at him, and Isaiah scolds him and says, you didn't ask for a sign. God offered one. You rejected him. Well, guess what? He's going to give you a sign anyway. And here's the sign. Isaiah says, here's the sign that you're going to have. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. Now this is a very important passage when you get to the birth of Jesus. This is quoted in Matthew, which we're going to get to. But this originally is not about Jesus. When Isaiah said this, it has nothing to do with Jesus. So put this aside. Matthew's going to quote it. We'll get back to why Matthew's going to quote it. Originally, this is about this crisis in the 8th century BCE between Judah and Aram and Israel and Assyria. And Isaiah's message is, here's the sign that God is going to give you. This young woman, which is actually what the word means here. When Matthew quotes it, it will actually be virgin, but here it's just young woman. This young woman is going to give birth to a baby. The baby will be called Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. And what Isaiah says, he says, listen, really by the time this baby's old enough to eat solid food and to choose its own food, this whole situation will be done. So on one hand, that's good news, but on the other hand, you've got to wait all of this time. Because this woman has to get pregnant, then she has to give birth, then this baby has to grow. So this isn't like a quick fix. That this baby is going to be a sign to you that God is going to deliver you. And here's the timeline that you can watch. By the time this baby's old enough to choose their own food and to choose the right food, this whole situation will be over. Those two nations will be done. So Emmanuel, this baby, is this sign that God is going to deliver you from the situation you find yourself in, from oppression, from defeat, from being conquered. Now, had Ahaz listened to Isaiah, this whole thing probably would have turned out great. But Ahaz doesn't listen to Isaiah. What Ahaz decides to do is he can't take any more pressure from Aram and Israel, so Ahaz runs off to Assyria, to the king of Assyria, and essentially tattles on his two neighbors. And he goes to the king of Assyria and he says, hey, listen, these two people are plotting a revolt against you. They want me to join. I don't want to join because you're Assyria and you're great and you're bigger and badder than all of us, but they keep pressuring me. They're going to conquer me. Can you come help me out? Assyria then takes its army and just levels Israel and Aram. just conquers them, gets rid of the kings, overthrows them. So in that sense, Ahaz saves Judah from these two neighbors. But when Assyria comes down into Aram and Israel, they don't stop at Aram and Israel. They come down into Judah. And they don't really get rid of Ahaz per se. They don't conquer Judah, but they come into Judah. They raid the temple. They raid the treasury. They start forcing Judah to pay them huge sums of money. They politically take over and control Judah from that point on. They introduce all kinds of Assyrian idols and gods into the culture of Judah, and a lot of Judah's citizens begin to turn away from worshiping and following Yahweh, the one true God of Israel, and they now start following these Assyrian idols and gods. And so Ahaz, by running off to Assyria, okay, he avoids the problem with Aram and with Israel. But the outcome is ultimately disastrous for Judah. It's disastrous politically, economically, and religiously. And the crazy thing is, as you fast forward, Judah never recovers from Ahaz's decision. Never. They will live on for quite a bit longer. They'll live on for over 100 years longer, but they will never be the politically independent nation they were. They will never have a thriving economy. Religiously, they will never be devoted to God. They will always kind of limp along until eventually Babylon conquers Assyria, and then Babylon marches down in and destroys Judah and exiles all the people. But this moment with Ahaz facing this decision on what to do, this ends up being the step that ultimately leads to the downfall of Judah. They will never, ever recover from this. Because Ahaz would not listen to Isaiah. He would not stand. He wouldn't wait. He needed to resolve it now, and ultimately what it led to was the destruction of his people and of his nation. So now, fast forward several centuries, and you get to the first century world. And you have the descendants of Judah, people who at this point are now referred to as Jews. That's where Jew comes from, a descendant of Judah. They are living in their ancestral homeland. But at this point, they are occupied by Rome. Rome is the new Assyria. Rome is the new Babylon. They're in charge. They control everything. The Jewish people are waiting for their promised Messiah. They're anticipating hope. They want deliverance. They want freedom. And after being silent for about 400 years, there's about 400 years between the Old and New Testament where God is essentially silent. There's no prophets that show up. There's no oracles that are delivered. It just seems like nothing is happening. But then God sends this messenger. The New Testament uses the word angel, but it's messenger is what it means. This messenger to this young woman, this young girl named Mary, and says, Mary, you are going to conceive and give birth to a son, and you shall name him Jesus. Mary tries to tell her husband Joseph, hey, here's what's happening. Joseph doesn't believe that this pregnancy is a miracle, and he assumes that, well, you cheated on me. He plans to divorce her. But then God sends another messenger to Joseph and says, hey, what your wife is telling you is 100% true. Don't leave her. So Joseph stays with her. They end up getting married. They go to the city of Bethlehem, which is Joseph's ancestral hometown. He's from the lineage of the great King David. They go there to report for the census that the Roman Empire has decided to take. When they go there, Mary gives birth to her son Jesus. And Matthew, in his account of the life of Jesus, here's what Matthew says. Matthew 1:22 through 23. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin, and here the word Matthew uses is actually, he's referring to the fact that she was a virgin. She had not had sex with anyone at that point. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So Matthew directly quotes from this story in Isaiah. But again, Matthew's not saying that what Isaiah said is this direct, here's this prediction, here's what's going to happen. That's not what he's saying. What Matthew is saying by quoting from this is Matthew saying, hey, this is like that. And really what he's doing, if you read Matthew's account, is Matthew is comparing Ahaz to Joseph. Because this is in response, this whole passage here is in response to Joseph and whether or not Joseph chooses to stay with Mary. And what Matthew's doing is he's placing this famous story from Israel's past that ultimately leads to the downfall of Judah, and he's saying Joseph now is faced with that exact same situation. That here you find Joseph in this situation where he's going to lose either way. Because if he stays with Mary, all these people are going to assume that they slept together before they were married, and they're going to be, branded with the scarlet letter, and everyone's going to think horrible things about him, and they're going to say horrible things about him. Even if they were to move away somehow, which you really didn't do in the ancient world, but people are going to be able to do the math. This is going to follow you the rest of your life. You're going to lose if you stay with her. You just will. But if you walk away from her, which in that case, even though they weren't fully married when he found out, being engaged was a legally binding arrangement, you're going to have to divorce her. And that's really not any better. So you find yourself, you are in this lose-lose situation, Joseph. No matter what you do, you're going to lose, you're going to be criticized, it's going to look bad for you, this is not the life you wanted. But this messenger shows up and says, just keep going. Just keep going. God is up to something. God is doing something. Ultimately, what God is doing is about the deliverance and freedom of his people. Just keep going. Joseph, like Ahaz, is not offered any quick fixes. He's not offered a bailout. He's not offered, hey, this all. No, you just have to keep going. And what Joseph is able to do is what Ahaz couldn't do. Joseph stays with it. Joseph chooses to trust in this messenger. Joseph stays with Mary, and where Ahaz's lack of trust leads to the downfall of all of Judah, Joseph's trust will actually ultimately lead to the salvation of the world. Because who will come from Mary is the Messiah, Jesus, the one who will make everything right. And see, this is Matthew's quoting of this passage from Isaiah. This is what he's doing. He's placing these two things and he's saying, this is like that. This was this pivotal moment. But Ahaz couldn't stand. Joseph was also in this pivotal moment, but he did stand. And what Matthew's doing is he's comparing not just Matthew and Ahaz, but the outcomes of those stories. One leads to destruction, one leads to salvation. And see, one of the things that Matthew's doing by comparing these two stories and by quoting this is he's telling us a little bit about this is what it means to be the Messiah. That to be the Messiah is ultimately about setting people free. To be the Messiah is ultimately about setting people free from whatever it is that oppresses them, that holds them, that binds them. In the first century world, people would have argued that Rome was the main thing that binds them. But Jesus comes along and says, no, there's something a lot more near and closer and internal to us. Jesus will use the word sin. He will say, anyone who sins is a slave to sin. And ultimately, that's what binds us all. What binds us all is these destructive patterns, these destructive behaviors, these things that we do that ultimately destroy us. They destroy the world around us. They destroy the physical world in which we live. They destroy our relationships. Paul will describe sin. He'll say, there are all these things that we don't want to do, but we keep doing them. We keep doing things and saying things that bring destruction. It's destroying ourselves. It's destroying our families, our relationships, our communities, and our world. Jesus says, this is what I came to set you free from. I came to set you free so that you could truly live the way that we were created as people to live. So on one hand, quoting this passage in Isaiah tells us a little bit about this is what it means to be the Messiah. The Messiah is here to set us free, to truly set us free from the one thing we can never set ourselves free from, the hold and the power of sin and death. By quoting from this story, Matthew also tells us what it means to respond to the Messiah. Because if you look at what Ahaz is invited to do, it's the same thing that Joseph's invited to do. This baby that's born will be a sign to you that God is going to be with you, that God is going to deliver you. Okay, it's what God is going to do. And what Ahaz and Joseph are both invited to do, they're both invited to do the exact same thing, which is patient endurance. That's all. Remember what Isaiah tells Ahaz? Stand firm in your faith. What does the messenger tell Joseph? Just stay with Mary. Doesn't really tell him to do anything great other than, hey, just don't do anything stupid. Just keep going. keep plugging along. That passage from Isaiah, if you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. That's the heart of really what it means to respond to the Messiah, is that you stand firm in your faith. That's why faith is a word the New Testament writers will use over and over again. Faith is how we respond to the Messiah. Faith is ultimately how we're a part of God's saving work. But I'm gonna be honest. Let me finish this statement before you judge me too harshly. The older I get, the more I don't kind of like the word faith. And here's why I don't like the word faith. There's nothing wrong with the word faith. My problem with the word faith is the way that we use it. We use the word faith to refer to something that we cognitively accept. At least like in a religious context. Like when someone says, do you have faith in Jesus? What we mean is, yes, I have cognitively accepted the fact that Jesus was God in the flesh, that Jesus died to forgive me so that I can die and I can go to heaven. And all we mean by faith is that I have cognitively accepted something to be true. But the word faith in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, the word I like better is trust, because trust is a relational term. To trust implies, yes, that I accept something to be true, but that thing that I accept to be true also drives my behavior and the direction of my life. What Ahaz is invited to do, and ultimately what Joseph is invited to do, is not just accept something as true, but to let that truth guide and direct their lives, knowing that if they let that truth guide and direct their lives, they're going to get made fun of. They're going to get judged. They're going to get criticized. They're going to find themselves in really awkward situations. They're going to live in the midst of tension, because nothing about what God promises either one of them is a quick fix. What God says is, you are going to have to patiently endure. That I will be victorious. And when I am victorious, your actions, your decisions will be vindicated. Ahaz, one day, your decision to do nothing will be vindicated. In the meantime, people are going to be scared. They're going to be afraid. They're going to think you're a terrible king. They're probably going to have recall votes to try to get rid of you. But in the end, when I am victorious, you will be vindicated. Joseph, same thing with you. People are going to say all kinds of mean things about you and that you're this and that you're that. All these things that you and I both know aren't true. But people are going to say them. You're going to live with them. But ultimately, one day, you will be vindicated. And you just need to trust me. And you just need to keep going. So one of the things about American Christianity in particular is in American Christianity, we are very much shaped not just by Scripture, but by ideas like success and prosperity. And we don't like to admit that, but the reality is, if we look at someone who is a Christian, or we look at churches or ministries or whatever, and if they are successful in terms of how many people show up, how much money they raise, all of that, then we just kind of assume, oh, well, God is clearly behind that. Because look, they're prospering. They're successful. And so we kind of equate success and prosperity with proof that this is actually God's thing. But the reality is, when you look all over both the Old and the New Testament, God is always successful, but God's definition of success is very different from our definition of success. Very different. God ultimately promises victory. He promises victory through Jesus, but he doesn't promise it quickly. He promises it ultimately, and he promises it completely, but never quickly. But see, as people, particularly I think as American Western Christians, we like, what's the shortest, quickest way to victory? We love shortcuts, don't we? We love shortcuts. I remember years and years ago, my wife and I, we had gotten quartz countertops in our kitchen. We had kind of a small kitchen time. We had these old tile countertops, and we had gone and we picked out these really cool quartz countertops. We weren't changing all the cabinets, just the countertops. So they came and they put the new countertops on, and to cover up, like just below the countertops, we were gonna put some molding, right? Like just to make it all look good. And so they came in, they put the countertops, they leveled it all down, and we had a friend who was like a legit contractor, was gonna come over and was gonna add this molding. And it was gonna look really nice, and they were gonna paint it. But I got up one morning and I wasn't working that day, and I was like, I want the molding here quicker. I don't want to wait 3 or 4 days for this molding. I want it to be there now because it looks bad now. It's all choppy and the paint's all chipped. And I'm like, I think I can do this. I'm a fairly handy person. I'm not the most handy person, but I'm a fairly handy person. So I'm like, I'm tired. I can't wait 3 days. I want this now. I'm going to do it now. So I did it myself. And in at least 3 places, chipped that countertop. And I had to call the guy back, and I was like, hey, is there any way to fix this kind of thing? Unfortunately, the guy came over, and he used resin, and I was trying to sneak it so my wife wouldn't know. But literally, he's there doing it, and she walks in the door, and she's like, what's this guy doing here? And I'm like, I'm sorry, babe, I totally screwed up, because I couldn't wait. I couldn't wait 3 days for someone who knew what they were doing. I had to take this shortcut. See, we always want to take shortcuts. Things like power, that's a shortcut. Control is a shortcut. Fear is a shortcut. Guilt is a shortcut. Shame is a shortcut. And these are the things sometimes we try to use because we think these will help us bring about the victory that God has promised. Shortcuts aren't always bad. But with the things that matter most, they never work. Growth, transformation, renewal, forgiveness, grace. There is no shortcut to those things. What it requires from us is the same thing God asked from Ahaz, that Ahaz didn't do, and it led to destruction and despair. But it's also the same thing God asked from Joseph, that ultimately is leading to the salvation and renewal of the world. It's patient endurance. All of us we go through our own things. We go through whatever we struggle with in life. But behind everything that we struggle with is this promise that God has made through Jesus, that there will be victory. It's a promise God made at the birth of Jesus, that Jesus came to the earth to save. And that ultimately, if our trust is in Jesus, not just do we cognitively accept it, but do we believe it, and do we let that belief guide our life? Do we live our life as if God has already won? And do we endure patiently? Do we keep going, trusting God will win? All of this will be vindicated. No matter what it looks like, He will make things right. And do we quit trying to find shortcuts? Quit trying to bring about our own prosperity and success. And let God do what God does the way that He does it, knowing that in Jesus, His promise is complete and final victory. And His invitation to us to share in that victory is patient endurance. Every day trusting that God will win and that we will share in that. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. I thank you that you loved us enough that you came down to earth in the person of Jesus. And in Jesus, you fulfilled every promise you had ever made. All the promises to Israel were fulfilled in and through the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. And that in Jesus, you made everything right. Even this, one of the reasons I love this story of Ahaz and Joseph is you took this moment of utter failure in Israel's past and you redeemed it to become something beautiful. And you do the same thing in our lives in the ways that we have failed in the past. Jesus redeems that and does something new with it. And Father, I know that the world that we live in now is a crazy world, filled with violence and evil and division, and that's true amongst nations, but God, it's also true in a lot of our own personal lives, our family lives, our friends, our relationships. And God, deep down, our desire is to win. Our desire is how can we take a shortcut? How can we be proved right? How can we be victorious? But that never works. And ultimately, God, it's not about us being victorious. It's about you being victorious. It's about you being king. It's about you bringing all of creation underneath yourself and making all things right. And the way we participate in that is patient endurance. That doesn't mean that we don't see victories. We do see victories. I see them all the time, often in little ways, in subtle ways. But all these little victories share and are a part of the bigger victory that you are bringing about through your Son. God, help us to always hold on to hope, to peace, to joy, and to love, and to live every day, trusting, knowing, embodying the reality that you are victorious. God, we love you and thank you and pray this in Jesus' name.